Hi guys, Mark DG here. Welcome to Refreshing Views Observatory. I've been sharing some high resolution pictures of the moon I've been taking with my C11 on the WhatsApp group of my local astronomy club. And I was asked by some of the members to publish my process, how I do that, the workflow. So I thought I'd show you the techniques that I use. Now these work for me with my telescope, with my settings, and I can't say these are the best way or the only way to do things, but they do work for me, and you're welcome to use these, adopt them, or simply ignore them. So let's get started. It's a clear night and we want to go and observe the moon. Now the simplest way of doing that is simply to use pencil and paper and make a sketch. And I really enjoy that feeling of calm as you intimately study over 30 minutes or an hour or so the lunar surface. Now what I use now though is a high-speed planetary camera, and that is doing what is called lucky imaging. And with one of these cameras I can capture far more details and far quickly as well. So we know that the people who are photographing the deep sky take multiple long duration exposures of deep sky objects. But for high resolution solar systems or lunar and planetary imaging, we're going to go the other way. We want to capture many thousands of very short duration frames using a high-speed camera. And these captures over several minutes, maybe several thousand to several tens of thousands of frames, from which some free software, which we'll download from the web, allows the best and the sharpest images of those frames to be stacked, and the blurred and distorted frames to be discarded. So here is my camera. It's an ASI 224MC. It's a colour camera, and it's small pixels, 3 micropixels or thereabouts across, and it's 1260 by 960 or thereabouts. I can't remember the exact numbers. High speed camera, USB 3, not that my laptop has USB 3. And I find if I'm shooting the moon full scale at that maximum setting, I can get about 60 frames a second. And if I'm using the region of interest, you can get that down to several hundred frames a second. So looking at something like Jupiter, in 2 minutes you can have tens of thousands of frames. Now of course, if you're using this camera, it's quite sensitive into the infrared. So you need to use an infrared blocking filter. And that means it's cutting out all that smearing, all that wavelengths from the far right. And this is the graph that shows that. And there's another effect you have if you're shooting in the optical wavelengths, is that you get a lot of chromatic aberration from the atmosphere. It's where the red and the blue light gets smeared out, and therefore you have to use this atmospheric dispersion corrector to the twiddly little levers on the side, bring that light back together again. The prisms inside it counteract that effect and bring the light back and smooth. And there's a picture of Venus I took last night using the ADC and the optical filter. Sorry, using the infrared filter, so I'm only shooting the optical wavelengths. Now of course the moon is black and white, so we're not so interested in colour. So I'd recommend using an infrared filter. This one here is a 742 nanometers. And what that does, it means you're right over in the far right of the infrared. And 2 reasons there. One, therefore your bandwidth is much less, so you're not going to get that chromatic aberration. So you don't need to use an infrared, sorry, you don't need to use an ADC if you're shooting in the infrared. And secondly, the seeing is better in the red. The light through the atmosphere gets less spread out. You know, that's why the sky is blue. In blue wavelengths it is smeared, the seeing is much worse. So an infrared filter for lunar imaging, where you're shooting in what in effect is a black and white object, gives you those two advantages. No chromatic aberration, therefore you don't need an ADC, and the seeing is better. So here's the telescope inside the observatory. I've just rolled the roof back. So that's a C11, Celestron C11 on an EQ6, and that's permanently mounted on the pier. And over here in the corner I've got I've got an old desk I inherited from when the children outgrew their old school desks. So I've taken this out to the observatory, got my cold weather clothing there. And here at the business end of the telescope we have the ASI 224 camera, high speed camera, ×2 Barlow, and I also bought one of the aftermarket Crayford focusers that go on the back of the on the back of the C11. What I found was that used to jiggle around quite a lot, just touching the focus would make the whole telescope jump around. So I bought a motorised focuser as well and mounted that on, so I now can have hands-free focusing, which is worth its weight in gold when you're up at f20 focal ratios, very long focal length. You know, what's that, sort of 5.5 meters long focal length. So that's motorised focus, absolutely essential. I've also got the dew shield on. I don't want any dew forming on the corrector plate. And what I'll do now is I'll just get the telescope line so we're looking at the moon. Now, my apologies, I should have mentioned this before we started setting up, but during the day you need to download the following software. The first is the drivers for your camera. Now that should come with the camera, but if not, you can download those from the manufacturer's website. The second is a tool that captures the video images, the high-speed frames, and that's called FireCapture. Now there's others as well, such as sharpen, but I like FireCapture. I've got used to that now, and I find it quite a powerful program. The next is Autostakkert 3, that's a Dutch name, and that will take the video footage, those high-speed frames, and crunch them together. It'll reject the blurry images and combine them together to give you a nice sharp images. And the final one is Registax 6, quite an old program now, but it's got a very good sharpening tool that I used to use to good effect to pull out all the hidden details within the video imagery. So download the drivers, download FireCapture, download Autostakkert, and download Registax 6. So I've got the telescope now lined up with the moon. I'm just waiting for it to clear the last of the branches. And what I'll do then, I've got the camera now plugged into the laptop. Let's start FireCapture. So now we've got the telescope lined up with the moon. We've got to get FireCapture up and running. There's a few things I want to talk through first. Now, with the telescope lined up on the moon, it's relatively easy to get it onto the small camera chip that I've got here. But if you're looking at something like one of the planets, Venus at the moment, or Mars later this year, it's often quite a challenge to get those planets centered right on the chip. So a flip mirror is something that's very useful. But the moon's relatively bright and relatively big, so just get it somewhere in the field of view, and normally it'll appear. Now, you may not be able to see it straight away simply because without the gain set up, I normally whack the gain up to about 400, 500. It may not be in focus, so you may be looking at a uniform sea of grey and not realise you're still lined up on the moon. So make sure you've got the gain turned about 400, 500 times, 400 or 500, and then try and adjust the focus, and then you should start to see the lunar features swimming into view as the focus smartens up. The next most important thing to mention is how important focus is, because it's that last sort of 1% that seems to make all the difference. Really take some time to get the focus absolutely nailed. It's not easy, particularly if you've got a manual focuser. As seen as the moon jumps in and out with the poor seeing, if the scope's jiggling around as well. But really trying to nail the focus really does make a difference to pulling out those last little bits of super sharp detail. Once we've lined up, then we've got it focused, we then want to adjust the settings, and I generally have the histogram at about 60%, and I'll talk you through that as well. And with the moon, obviously it takes 28 days to make a revolution, so the terminator moves really slowly. So I'm quite happy to take several minutes taking the exposure. So I'm happy to sacrifice gain, which is the electrical amplification of the signal, for frame rate. Now, if you're choosing something like Jupiter, which rotates in 10 hours, you obviously want to be capturing stuff really quickly. And therefore, actually, you do want to have a higher gain and so you can reduce the images and say capture a 2 or 3 minute video sequence. But for the moon, I'd say generally about 300 times, maybe 400 times gain, and then adjust the exposure so that your histogram, we'll go through this later, is at about 60%. So lining up, make sure you've got focus, go back and forth to the focus, make sure you've absolutely nailed it, and you'll see why when you do this. An electrical focuser is worth its weight in gold. And then get the histogram at about 60%. The final important thing to remember is that on FireCapture you can set up what's called regions of interest, and regions of interest allow you to adjust the video size, i.e. the pixels by pixels, so you can have, sort of 200 by 200 pixels or 1000 by 900 pixels, something like that. So for the moon I generally tend to shoot quite large, full frame. That does hoover up memory, so you will need gigabytes of spare space on your laptop or on your computer. It really does hoover up, 10,000 frames at, whatever it is. It can be several tens of gigabytes quite quickly. So be aware of that. You do need an empty hard drive ready to do your lunar captures. Planetary images, planets tend to be much smaller. You tend to get away with it, so that much better. So, okay, let's go do some captures. So I've got the moon now on the laptop screen. What I'm going to do now is just adjust the focus using my motorized focuser. I see the image is becoming sharper now. I'm just fine tuning the focus, going back and forth. Make sure I can get the sharpest image I can. You can really see how bad the seeing is. Things are jumping around. Well, that doesn't look too bad for a quick look. So with my setup, then the next thing I do is over here where the mouse is wiggling around. We've got gain and exposure. I generally leave gain at about 300 for the moon shots, particularly with the infrared filter. And then what I do is then use the exposure, use these up and down buttons here. And then what you've got to try and do then is get the histogram, which is here, to be about 60%. So you can see once that, what I'll do then is move the exposure up. And then there you can see the histogram. Any lower and the image isn't so good when you process it, and any more you end up with an oversaturated image. So you generally want to be around about 60%, maybe 50. I wouldn't go any higher than that, but again, that's my judgment with my setup. Okay, so let's review where we've got to. We've got our high-speed camera, we've got our filter, we've put a Barlow lens in, and we have found, and we are now tracking on the moon. I didn't mention earlier that you can use an altazimuth mount or an equatorial mount. The video file lengths that we use would tend to be sort of a minute or two long, so image rotation that you get from having an altazimuth mount isn't really a problem. Now, an equatorial mount, you don't have to worry about image rotation, but because the video sequences we capture are so short, you don't really get that in an altazimuth mount. But you definitely want to have tracking. I can't imagine what doing this is like, trying to focus as the moon or the planet you're trying to image slowly crawls across the screen. So definitely you want to be tracking. Then we've got FireCapture up and running. We've got a gain of around 300 to 400. We've ensured our exposure to give us a histogram around 50 to 60%. We've focused, we've refocused, we've checked focus, and we will continue to check focus as the night goes on. And we've captured about 10,000 frames of an interesting feature. And now we'll move on to the processing stage. Now what we want to do here is enhance details within the data. We don't want to introduce false artifacts. So to do this then, we're going to boot up Autostakkert. And the first thing you do is open up your file or files if you've done more than one capture. Set it to a surface as your field of view, or the detail will fill the field of view. Unless of course you're shooting a planetary thing, or you've got the moon with a very small lens. I leave the setting at 4 for the seeing, and I press analyze, and at this point go away and make a cup of tea and come back. Now here comes the tricky part, setting the alignment points. Now what Autostakkert is doing at this point is it's breaking the image down into lots of little squares, and it's searching through the stack trying to find the sharpest one of each of these little squares, and then it'll come back and combine all those little squares like a mosaic back into the overall picture. So each picture then is the sharpest, or each square is a multitude of little alignment points. Now if you make them too big, the details may blur out from one square to the other as the atmosphere moves, as the scene changes. So you want to have small alignment points. But if you make them too small, the computer struggles to make sure they all line up again nice and neatly. So you can get this sort of crazy paving, sort of mosaic grid that appears in parts or some of the image. So I generally go for around about 140 pixels. Again, like all these sort of settings I'm using, this is what works for me, so try and use what you think works for you. So generally around about 140 pixels. And I set the minimum brightness to 0. And out of laziness, I simply stack 500, 1000 and 2000 frames. So I'm stacking, out of the 10,000, I'm stacking 500, 1000 and 2000 frames. So what I do, if I've been out looking at the moon, I might have spent several hours out there setting up, capturing the stuff, and then locking the observatory up again. So I tend to come back in with the laptop, and I'll process this as I'm getting ready for bed, and then I'll hit stack and leave this running overnight. So that when I come down in the morning, I've then got a stacked set of frames ready to process the next morning. And that does take several hours to do, so it's best to do it the night that you've captured it, ready to look at the next morning. So over a cup of tea the next morning, I'll open up the video files, so open up the process frames, the stack frames, and I'll open up Registax 6. Now Registax 6 is well, you can use this to stack your frames as well, but it's quite an old program now, so Autostakkert 3, by breaking everything up into lots of little bits, it seems to be doing that a little bit better. So I don't really bother using the stack for Registax 6. I only use it to sharpen. Now I learnt this from watching a talk that Martin Lewis at skyinspector.com gave, and I used to really struggle to get my wavelets, these little slider things here, to work. And I used to play around for ages without really knowing what I was doing. And he pointed out, so if you use linked wavelets, this button here, and slide them to the right, slide the top one to the right, that allows all the rest to follow behind in the mathematics. So I literally now just use linked wavelets and slide it across to the right, and then sharpen and denoise slightly. So of course, as you sharpen an image, you introduce noise, that amplification of the background signal. So a little bit of sharpen and then a little bit of background noise. And I save that image. That's all there is to it. You can play around for hours with wavelets. There's videos and talks and YouTube tutorials all over the internet. So it's something that you could write hours, talk and research on for hours on that one. But try using the link wavelets, sliding across of half or 2/3 of the way across, and see what happens. But again, what I find with this is this works very well on my C11. But if I use the same scheme on the images I caught with my little travel scope with a little 6-inch Mac, it doesn't work as well. So try and find what works with you. What works with me probably won't work with you. So what we've got now then is a raw video footage that we've stacked together in Autostakkert, and we've given it a sharpen in Registax. And now what I finally do is just give it a little touch up in in Photoshop. So in addition to using linked wavelets, I also have a number of different moon settings that I've got. So this one here is Moon C11 version 6, and we're looking at the southern rim of the Grimaldi impact basin on the limb of the moon. And I sometimes find this is my latest setting, Moon C11 version 6. And as you can see there, it pulls out a lot of fine detail. You can see some of the riles and cracks in the lunar surface extending out. 2 points to note with these settings is that the image is sort of this purpley red, and obviously that's because we're shooting the red end of the spectrum, so that's why it appears red rather than black and white. And of course we'll sort that out later in Photoshop. And also there's no way I could sketch this amount of detail, and certainly not take a number of shots. You know, this is several hours of work to produce this sort of fine level of detail. So you can see how photography actually brings out so much more than sketching does. The downside is, of course, you don't sort of intimately study this area and don't pick out all that sort of detail, because the camera just does its thing and you watch the screen and you look at the pictures afterwards. So there's pluses and minuses. There's no really right or wrong way to do it. It's just different ways of doing the same thing, whatever you enjoy. So Jess, try Moon C11 version 6, see if that works for you as well. One of the other points is that with every scope, with every setup, seems to produce a different image scale, and what works on one telescope certainly doesn't work on another. But there you are. In addition to using link wavelets, I also use Moon C11 version 6. So having stacked the video frames together and chosen our sharpest, and then put them through the wavelets in Registax, the final thing I do is open up Photoshop and just give it a final touch up. So as we said earlier, there's very little colour on the moon, and so I convert the image to black and white. I'll crop the corners so you get rid of all these little bits where the frames didn't quite line up properly. I more often than not give it a very gentle unsharp mask just to get rid of that. I'll also go around the image itself, make sure there's not too much noise, and if necessary using the denoise tool. And it's important thing to notice is you don't want to denoise or use the noise filter and reduce the noise over the whole image. I'll only use this in bits where the noise has got too bad, so I'm not blurring out everything. And the final thing I do is make sure that the image is nice and dark. The shadows are black, so we definitely want to make sure that the shadows that we see on the moon really are black. The simplest way to do it is to slide the levels across here, but then of course you've got to move the median filter back so your gamma's in the right place. So another way of doing that, which I find quite well, is to use the blur and dodge tool. So one makes it lighter, and we can use that then to, if we've got features that are too dark and we want to make them lighter, and we can also then make sure our shadows and bits within the craters are nice and dark as well. And what I suggest you do, and I should have mentioned this earlier, as we go through this process, as we go through the raw video footage, is that we save those video files, we save the stack. If you remember, we've got 500, 1000 and 2000 frames stacked together. I then sharpen those up and save the sharpen that I got from Registax, and then I use the save as now in Photoshop. So if I make a mistake and want to go back and open up the original, I don't have to go all the way back to that raw video file and wait for Autostakkert to put them all together again. So you have each of those frames, each of those images are then put together, and at least you can go back and access it. The final point I'd like to suggest as well is don't over process. It's so often you see images where the bright patches are really stretched out and the dark's really dark. So make sure your image looks pleasing to the eye, and sometimes it's worth just looking away from the screen and then looking back and making sure you're looking at it with a fresh set of eyes. Don't over process and make it look really stretched and horrible. Be careful you don't introduce any false artifacts as well. Now, after a night or two of this, you'll realise you don't have any space left on your hard drive. So I tend to apart from a handful that have been where the seeing has been exemplary, I delete the video files, because you soon end up with gigabytes of data sitting on hard drives. Some people burn them onto disk. I tend not to bother, because it's very rare that I would actually go back to the original video file. But as I was saying earlier, I do keep the stacked files, and then I look at my Registax settings or what I've been learning to do in Photoshop and see if I can bring out a little bit more detail, or if I've made a mistake in, you know, hiding a feature or writing over something, then at least you can go back and check it. So I hope you found that useful. I think we've gone all the way then from setting up and buying a camera, choosing a filter, lining up on the moon, focus, capturing, stacking it together, sharpening, and then processing in Photoshop. I will now wish you a lovely day and look forward to catching up with you soon.